Well, guys, it's time for a third party, isn't it? That's what it's looking like. Dem exit is trending on Twitter. Bernie Sanders, unfortunately, looks like he was defeated tonight in the second round of Super Tuesday primaries, and it looks like he's most likely going to concede, hand the baton over to Joe Biden, and we're stuck with corporate crony capitalist Joe Biden as the Democratic nominee. So a lot of people are very upset and say, no, we're not going to do this again. We are going to exit and we are going to have a third party. That is what we're going to do. Now, there is a right way and a wrong way to do this. And in order to understand the wrong way to do this, we have to take a look back at the two previous attempts at a progressive party. Yes, there were two previous attempts, maybe even more if we go back into the 1800s. But there definitely were two, and unfortunately those two failed. We need to see why they failed so that we can move forward successfully this time. So let's take a look. Now, the first Progressive Party was formed in 1912 by Teddy Roosevelt, Republican Teddy Roosevelt. So what had happened was Roosevelt had served 2 terms as president, and he had done a lot of work for the people. He was a great president. He has gone down in history as one of the greatest presidents of all time. He has his, face in stone at Mount Rushmore. And Teddy Roosevelt felt like at the time that the only person he could pass the baton to who would be good for the presidency would be Taft, and William Howard Taft. And he felt like Taft would be the guy that could carry that baton and continue Roosevelt's work. Well, unfortunately, Taft got into the presidency and he kind of became establishment. He started to really rub elbows with the wealthy and fall into the trap of crony capitalism and monopolies and doing what's best for corporations and not what was best for the people. And this was a great disappointment to Theodore Roosevelt. So he decided that he was going to challenge Taft for the presidency for a third term. Roosevelt was going to go for it again. This time he was going to bring the government back to the people. He started campaigning on a message that was very, very similar to Bernie Sanders' message, and just saying, we've gone too far, the powerful have too much power, and we need to bring this back to the people. Well, during the primary, the Democratic primary, what had happened was Roosevelt ran in all of the at this point in the 1900s. And prior to that point, not every state had a primary. So it was only select states around the country. Well, Teddy Roosevelt went and campaigned in those primaries and won 9 out of the 13 primaries. There were only 13 primaries at that time, but he won 9 out of the 13 for the Republican nomination to be the candidate. And Taft, on the other hand, didn't win any of those, but understood that the process, which is very much what we have today, runs on delegates. So the primaries are really just people, the population signaling who they would like, but it's not actually binding. And Taft understood that really what was binding would be the delegates. And so he didn't actually go and campaign for the primaries. Instead, what he did was he used his power as president to, as the head of the establishment at that point, to throw his weight around and basically pressure the delegates from all the other states to vote for him. So when it came down to the convention, even though Roosevelt had won the primaries in the states that had held them, he unfortunately did not win the delegates because Taft was able to throw his establishment weight around and get those delegates to vote for him at the convention. Sounds familiar, right? It gets worse when we go to the second progressive movement in the 60s. It gets worse, believe it or not. So Roosevelt then realizes that the establishment has gone too far. They're going to nominate Taft, and he decides to break away and create his own party. And he asks people, are you with me? So he did what Bernie Sanders should do. Teddy Roosevelt had the guts to do this. And by the way, Roosevelt was a badass. That guy got shot. Literally, he got shot. Somebody had an assassination attempt on his life the night of the convention, and he went in there with a gunshot, and he still went and gave a speech. I mean, this guy was a true progressive. He was a true badass in every sense of the word. And he was badass enough to say, I've had it with you people. I am not going to fall in line. I'm going to create my own party, and I'm going to take this country back. So he creates the Bull Moose Party, which is the Progressive Party of 1912. And breaks away from the Republican Party and runs in his own formed political party. Well, the problem that happened was that at the time, Woodrow Wilson was running on the Democratic ticket. Now, back then, the Democrats were, and you could argue throughout time, back then, for sure, the Democrats were not a good party. And you could argue that they never really became a good party. I'm going to look back and see if there was a glimmer in time when the Democrats were actually good and for the people and truly for what was best for the country. But I'm not sure about that. So that's a different story for a different day. But Woodrow Wilson had the Democratic nomination. Taft was the incumbent president, and he had the Republican nomination. And Roosevelt, the former president of the United States, ran on the Bull Moose, the Progressive Party platform. Well, when it came down to the elections, Woodrow Wilson ended up getting 40-something% of the vote. And unfortunately, what happened with the Progressives and the Republicans is they ended up splitting the ticket. So they each got 20-something%, which was not enough. And Woodrow Wilson ended up becoming president of the United States. And that was because the Progressive ticket was split on the Republican side. However, I will say this, Taft ended up coming in third. So Teddy Roosevelt, with that progressive half of the Republican Party, ended up coming in second in that presidential general election. So he was more popular, and the progressive movement at that time was more popular than the Republican establishment wing of the party. Unfortunately, the Democrats had the majority, and they ended up winning. Now, this is the narrative we still hear today. What happened was, if you combine the tickets with Theodore Roosevelt and William Howard Taft, that combined vote would have been greater than Woodrow Wilson. So this is where you hear the narrative of a vote for somebody else is a vote for Trump, right? And back in 1912, in that election, that's what happened. Had Roosevelt not created that third party ticket, and he would have just stayed on the Republican ticket, the Republicans likely would have won that election. So I'm sure you're kind of getting some of the gist of what happened there and why that party ended up failing. Ultimately, the people in the Progressive Party decided to fold back into the flock. They realized that there was no path forward in a third party splitting the vote with Republicans, and that they would just have to fold back in if they ever had a shot at winning as Republicans. Now, what happened with those progressives was many of them went back to the Republican Party, and some of them went over to the Democratic Party. But ultimately, they folded back into the two-party system. Now, fast forward, let's go 50 years later, and you've got the primaries that happened in the 60s. So this was in 1968. There was the Democratic primary, and what happened was Hubert Humphrey, actually, I'm trying to look it up right here so I could just make sure I get all the facts, because right now I'm just going off the top of my head. But Humphrey ended up getting the nomination in the 1968 convention. And the guy didn't run in a... Now, this is the Democratic Party. So the next progressive movement split from the Democrats. And in 1968, Hubert Humphrey ended up with the nomination for the Democratic nomination for president without running in a single primary. So it's the same thing that happened with Taft, who was president and didn't run in a single... he ran, but Roosevelt ended up winning in the popular states, and Taft was able to throw his weight around with the other states and get the nomination because he was all establishment. Well, in 1968, it was worse. Hubert Humphrey didn't even run in the primaries. He said, why do I need to run in the primaries? All I got to do is win over the delegates, because it's a delegate system. I don't need to win the popular vote. Who cares about the people? So Hubert Humphrey did not even run in the primaries. He ran in the primaries. There were plenty of other candidates. Many of them at that point in 1968 were anti-war candidates. And Hubert Humphrey didn't even run in the primaries. He instead went straight to the delegates, campaigned the delegates, and won the Democratic nomination. This created a riot. This was in the Chicago Convention of 1968. People rioted. They realized that their votes actually didn't matter, and that it was a sham, and that the anti-war candidates would be buried by the establishment, that the establishment would win because of the system of delegates, that you don't need to listen to the American people, that you instead have these elite who go to the convention and they end up casting the votes on behalf of the people, and they override the entire system. So there was a big riot. People said, this is shit. And they were right. And so what happened was the Democratic Party had to make some changes after the riots in 1968. They made changes in the 1972 convention. They said, okay, fine, we'll go with the popular vote. George McGovern, who was an anti-war progressive candidate, ended up getting the nomination by popular vote. And the Democratic Party did what we're seeing today with Bernie Sanders. They went on a major media campaign to smear the guy. They made him into somebody very unlikable, which is what we're seeing with Bernie Sanders, that, oh, he's a Russian. He cozies up with the Russians. He tried to have a Russian sister city. He went on his honeymoon to Russia. He's a Russian asset. He's a socialist. They go on and say all these things that are very negative. And they did this in 1972 to George McGovern. There was actually a movement of Democrats that came out saying Democrats for Nixon. They wanted Nixon over George McGovern, and they actually campaigned on behalf of Nixon. So in 1972, the progressive movement won the popular vote. The people were very excited about this, but the Democratic establishment smeared George McGovern so badly that he was defeated soundly in the 1972 election against Richard Nixon. He won 2 states, and only 2 states. And that was largely because of the media campaign against him. So, roughly every 50 years, we have this uprising of the people where we say we are fed up. We don't want to deal with this crony capitalism anymore. We're being robbed by the wealthy. The government is overrun by the wealthy, and we want to take our government back. In fact, let me just read to you some of the platform of the Progressive Party of 1912 so that you can understand just how similar it is to today. And it's very similar to the progressive platform of the late 60s, early 70s. Here it was Roosevelt's Square Deal. And the Square Deal, which was the progressive movement, the platform was, says here, the Square Deal was President Theodore Roosevelt's domestic program, which reflected his 3 major goals: conservation of national resources. Excuse me, my phone. Gosh, I don't even want to read the notification. It's a news notification. Are they going to tell me some bad news, more bad news about the primary? Says the Square Deal was President Theodore Roosevelt's domestic program, which reflected his 3 major goals: conservation of natural resources. So that would be like the Green New Deal. Control of corporations. So this is what Bernie Sanders talks about. Even Elizabeth Warren talked a lot about this, of the corporations need to be regulated. And consumer protection. These 3 demands are often referred to as the 3 C's of Roosevelt's Square Deal. So he also talked heavily about, here in the progressive movement here, the platform also asserted that to dissolve the unholy alliance between corporate business and corporate politics is the first task of statesmanship of the day. So look at that. Get rid of the money in politics. Dissolve the unholy alliance between corporate business and corporate politics. That is the progressive movement at its core, and that has been the progressive movement at its core, along with a better foreign policy. Now, Teddy Roosevelt wasn't, I definitely wouldn't say the guy was anti-war. I would say that he was war on behalf of humanitarian efforts, which is not always bad. I do personally also agree that we should be going in for humanitarian reasons if it's truly humanitarian. The problem is right now we're being sold these lies of, it's for humanitarian reasons and really it's for big oil or something. But if it's truly humanitarian, I think many of us can agree with that is a time when you do go to battle for the greater good of the people, like defeating Nazis, and saying, okay, they're eradicating a whole group of people. It's genocide or things like that for sure. But, so, in the 60s and 70s, we also saw progressive movement rise up. We also saw the establishment effectively take it down. And a lot of that is the inability to make a coalition. So let's talk about a coalition. Now, what we're seeing in today's modern times is that the Democratic Party, which is basically Republican light, the Democratic Party has they have decided that their new strategy to defeat Donald Trump is to coalesce, but not with the progressive wing of the party. At least that's not what they've been touting so far. They could make that change. They could decide to coalesce with the progressive wing. We'll see who Joe Biden picks as his vice president. But if Joe Biden, as the nominee, selects, let's say, Amy Klobuchar, or he even goes after a Republican vice president pick, which he's mentioned maybe doing, then you're looking at a coalition. They're building a coalition with Republicans. They're saying, we're going to go get the never Trump class. This isn't necessarily a bad strategy. What they're saying is, okay, forget the populist left wing. We're going to go after this other wing, and these people don't like Trump, so we're going to go ahead and do that. Well, guess what? Two can play this game. The way to defeat the establishment and to create a third party is we have to create a coalition as progressives. Progressives cannot break away on their own and do what Teddy Roosevelt's Bull Moose Party did, split the Democratic ticket until people get sick of losing and they finally just fold back into the flock. That is not the way. The way forward is the progressives on the left have to find the progressives on the right and coalesce with them. That means the populist movement that we have seen rising on the right are the very people that the populists on the left need to join together with. And this, I know, seems like an unnatural marriage. I know a lot of people are going to say, what, to this idea. But I promise you, the way forward, there's just no way you can win. Look, there's no way that the Progressive Party can win breaking off from the Democratic Party and living on an island on its own. The progressive movement has to coalesce with the populist progressive movement of the right. And if right-wing Republican populist America will recognize that they are the Teddy Roosevelt populists of 1912, then there's an actual shot at creating a progressive movement that defeats the establishment. As the Democratic establishment starts to form together with the Mitt Romney, John McCain, George Bush establishment of the Republican Party, then yes, actually there is a lane for, believe it or not, the Donald Trump populists and the Bernie Sanders populists. There are these people in America who say, I was either going to vote for Bernie Sanders or Donald Trump. They gave me Hillary Clinton, so I voted for Donald Trump. We have to get into the minds of that person and create the party around that person. We're not going to agree on everything, but guess what? The Democratic Party right now doesn't agree on everything, and neither does the Republican Party. You're never going to agree 100% on a platform, but at least if you can agree on the basic principles of that platform, you've got a shot. And the thing about the Trump progressives, the thing about the Trump populist movement was that Trump ran on a platform of drain the swamp, that we're going to, people wanted somebody new and fresh who was an outsider, who wasn't in politics. They wanted to hear end the wars. Trump ran on ending wars, on draining the corporate crony swamp, and on taking care of America, taking care of the American people. And Bernie Sanders has the exact same message. He has the exact same message. He says, drain the swamp. The crony corporate capitalists are robbing the American people. He says, end the wars. We've got to end these ridiculous wars. I'm not going to support them. Now, a lot of people, they might not like the foreign policy of Trump and Bernie Sanders. They might say, well, they're not totally anti-war, and that's true, they're not, but they're way more anti-war than the Democrat-Republican, we could call them the Democratic-Republican Party establishment. That was the party back in the day. The government of the United States used to have, really up until the mid-1800s, there was only one party, and it was actually called the Democratic-Republican Party. They might as well join forces and just be the Democratic-Republican Party and call a spade a spade. So Trump, the Trump populist movement and the Bernie Sanders populist movement, Bernie Sanders saying we got to take care of the American workers. Bernie Sanders is not for open borders. He is saying, no, there's no way we can have open borders if we're going to raise the minimum wage and have Medicare for all. And the Trump populist movement, the messages are very, very similar. And I believe that if the two populist groups can coalesce together, that is the path forward for a third party. And that is the only path forward. Look, you might not like it, but it's the only thing it's the only way to make it. You have to accept it. If you want a third party, you have to swallow it and say, we're going to coalesce with the right wing. And if you're right wing and you're watching this, you're going to have to suck it up and say, we're going to coalesce with the Bernie Sanders populist movement. The populists have to get together and become a new progressive party, a Teddy Roosevelt progressive party in a way, and say we're marching forward for the people. And this is it. So a ticket in this platform would look kind of like a Tulsi Gabbard Ivanka Trump ticket, in 2024. Imagine that for a minute. A Tulsi Gabbard Ivanka Trump. Now, I'm not a big fan of Ivanka because I don't like her husband, Jared. I think he's a giant. He's way too pro-Israel for my tastes. And his, peace plan is only creating a lack of peace in the Middle East. So I'm not necessarily saying Ivanka Trump. If she were to divorce the guy, sure, let's do it. But somebody like that, you've got to have like a coalition between like a Bernie Sanders and a Steve Bannon. Bernie is not going to be around in 2024. And I know that these might be shocking tickets to think about, but I want you to open your mind for a minute and really understand that the only path forward for a progressive third party is if we coalesce with right-wing populist America. And there are things to coalesce alongside with each other for. The biggest one is getting rid of the crony capitalist corporate America that has been robbing the American people. And once we do that, once we get rid of that, then we can start having a discussion of the values and the morals. Now, remember, a lot of the right-wing populist America, a lot of them are libertarians. And they are also for the same social issues that left-wing America's for. They say, fine, gay marriage, okay, a woman's right to choose. There's a lot of that in right-wing America. They just say it's not the government's place to regulate these things. So this ticket wouldn't be at odds when you're looking at even the social aspects. The ticket's really not at odds on a lot of the major things. And even then, when you look at the early, the 1970s, the Democratic Party, my very first video on this channel I actually did was the history of government shutdowns. And if you watch the history of government shutdowns, you'll find that in the 70s, all the government shutdowns in the 70s and really into the 80s were the Democratic Party shutting each other down. They had control of the House and they kept shutting down because they couldn't agree on women's reproduction rights. And that was Democrat on Democrat fighting. So, disagreeing over a variety of aspects of the platform within the party is pretty normal. I don't think we could expect that if we were to coalesce with populist right-wing America, that we would agree on everything. But I think there would be enough agreement on enough of the big things to truly create a third ticket that actually makes some waves. Now, when will this happen? It won't happen until Donald Trump is out of office. I think if Biden's the nominee, Trump's going to win again. If Trump wins again, then I think in 2024, it depends on what the Republicans do. If the Republicans decide that they're going to try to go back to normalcy and create the Republican Party of McCain and Romney and Bush, and they ignore the populist movement that's gone on right-wing America, then I think that a lot of those Trump supporters will fold and they'll say, forget this. We said drain the swamp and you guys just gave us same old all over again. And I think a lot of them will say, okay, it's time to coalesce. And they would join a coalition alongside the left-wing progressive movement. I know it's hard to envision for a lot of people, but keep your mind open because I can tell you this, there is absolutely no path forward for a third party if there isn't a coalition with right-wing America. The only way you can do that is if the Republican Party splits and there's four parties. But a strong Republican front with a divided Democratic front only means Republicans win over and over and over again. The only way to do it is to coalesce. You have to figure out what you're willing to compromise on. And right now, in my mind, the biggest number one issue that our country faces is the corporate crony capitalism going on in Washington that's robbing America blind. The rest of it, I think people point out, well, what about the justices? They're going to keep appointing conservative justices. That just means that they undo, if they undo Roe v. Wade, for example, it means that your state will decide on what's going to happen. It defaults to state rights. It doesn't mean that suddenly Christian America is taken over and you're not able to get services, or if they I mean, it's not it's not good, but it's also not, if you're living, especially in a liberal state, if you're living in a state that shares your values, you're fine. Because it just reverts back to states' rights. It's not reverting back to, oh no, women even in California can't get services. That's just not, it just diverts to state right. It just reverts back to states' rights. So I'm not too afraid of that, because that can always change. What I am afraid of is the United States becoming a giant banana republic. I'm afraid for our future generations. I'm afraid that we're only going to see more and more poverty and less opportunity and more corruption, and that we are going to become a legitimate banana republic. That is my big fear, more than anything. Thank you so much for joining the channel. If you have not yet, please subscribe. Subscribing helps get this channel in front of more eyeballs, so it's always helpful for the algorithm of YouTube. Thank you so much. I'd love to hear your comments below. What do you think? What is the path forward to a third party? Comment below. Thanks for watching.